Thank you again for joining us today for our webinar, Are You Prepared to Handle Security Threats to Your Business? I'd like to introduce you to Andrea Scove, Chief Marketing Officer for Netgain Technologies. Andrea, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. We are excited to discuss this very important topic of business security.
And I'd also like to introduce you to Scott Logan, who is the Technical Director of Security for Netgain Technologies. Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to discuss a range of business security challenges and threats, as well as ways for your organizations to remediate risk. I want to remind you again that you can ask a question during the presentation or after the presentation by simply typing your question into the box found in the lower right corner of your screen. If we don't get to all of your questions, we will follow up with you. So we're going to open our discussion with an audience polling question asking you, our attendees, what security measures your organization already has in place. Please check all boxes that apply to your business. We're asking you if you have security experts on staff, if you perform continuous security testing and training, if you perform quarterly network vulnerability tests, if you have an incident response plan and a team to execute it, and if you have email spam removal, content filtering, and ATP. These questions are largely straightforward. However, Scott, can you give us some simple clarity around ATP, or Advanced Threat Protection?
Absolutely. So advanced threat protection is more than just a signature-based recognition of any malicious attack that can occur through email or through internet surfing platforms, in which it can recognize it by behavior. So an advanced threat protection platform is an uptick in your ability to stop a malicious attack.
Interesting. Our audience has told us that half of them, a little over, have an incident response plan. But interestingly, and they have spam removal and content filtering, but interestingly, continuous security testing and training and quarterly network vulnerability tests seem to fall short. Is that what you're seeing, Scott, as you are in the market working with organizations everywhere?
Absolutely. This is exactly what I see when I go out. Poor social awareness training within their environment, not keeping a good social awareness platform going on with continuous testing and training, and then not inspecting their actual systems that are deployed, their assets that are deployed in their environment for vulnerability is a common lack of testing that's going on. And so this is exactly what I see when I'm out in the field.
Thank you. Well, the cybersecurity stats are truly daunting. A breach every 39 seconds, 6 billion business records stolen since 2013, 92% of malware delivered via email, despite the fact that our audience is telling us they have all kinds of filtering and spam protection. And 60% of network malware infections are caused by social engineering, which is largely email. The landscape, regardless of what people are doing, is truly, truly dangerous. So, Scott, can you tell us about all of these threats that we're facing?
Let's start with the first one, business email compromise. That's what the feds call it, BEC. It's also referred to CEO fraud. 740 million records lost since 2013, with the fact of somebody trying to emulate or represent somebody that's important in the company, like the CEO, and request for an end user to do something that maybe be outside of their standard protocols. Maybe it's wire money or to execute some kind of administration or authentication allowance to somebody that on request of the CEO. Business email compromise is just an enormous threat. It's a whale fishing campaign, and that is one of the top threats that are out there right now. Ransomware has not gone away. It had a major uptick in 2017. It kind of dropped a little bit in 2018 as Cybercoin kind of dropped in its price, but it's back again in 2019, and it's worse than it's ever been. It's really kind of readjusted its focus to just not SMB market anymore, but now it's moved into enterprise size businesses. It's looking for the bigger dollar. And what it's doing now is not just encrypting the data and holding it hostage, but now it's actually going out and destroying backups so that you have no recovery model associated to the ransomware and you're more likely to pay. The next is form jacking. Form jacking is mostly related to retail sites, but it is still a serious cyber threat. An attacker will actually get into a retail's website and they will redirect the request for credit card information to themselves. So they'll inject kind of a man-in-the-middle interface into the website, and then when you submit your credit card for your purchase, whatever retail site you're on, that information that you submit, a copy of it goes to the attacker as well. Form jacking is very popular. As you can see in this statement, 48,000 websites are hacked a month with some sort of form jacking. Botnet attacks are denial of service attacks. They're not out there to gain financial impact. They're out there to destroy. And what they do is they're downloaded through some form of malware, and when they get on the machines, they take over resources of the machine so that the machine no longer has the ability to perform normal operations. The resources are all claimed by the botnet. The system behaves slowly to the point of not being able to operate at all. So like I said, it's a simulation of a denial of service attack. Cloud attacks started really happening in 2018, and you can see that in this record here, 70 million records were stolen from misconfigured cloud storage up in the Amazon Web Service, according to Symantec. And cloud attacks are becoming more and more popular as more and more businesses starting to put their trusted data up in the cloud. Cloud attacks, I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think that that's just going to be the new focus of attack more than on-premise attacks. Internet of Things, IoT attacks, are everywhere. Everybody has simple Internet of Things types of devices like routers, camera systems, your Alexa device in your home. These are all IoT attacks, and they're IoT attacks because the devices have a very poor security mechanism surrounding them. They're more designed to be accessible than they are to be secure. And hackers know that. And they know that they have built-in backdoors that allow them to execute root or administrative control over the device so that they can attack further into the enterprise. So IoT attacks are very popular. Supply chain attacks are on the uptick as well. And supply chain attacks are vendor relationships. So if you remember back in the day with Target got hacked through their HVAC company, right? The HVAC company was the actual attack, and then through their relationship to Target, they were able to move and get into Target's data. And supply chains attacks are very popular. The responsibility for businesses to monitor and audit vendor relationships that they have are very prominent now in audits. And so supply chain attacks are very severe.
Thank you, Scott. The variety of security attacks is frightening to many business people. So can you talk to us, Scott, about how do the hackers get in and what can businesses do to reduce the threats?
All right. Well, it's really important to understand how they're getting in, and then we'll talk about some of the things that you can do to be preventive. But end user is your weakest link in your security. Doesn't matter how strong your firewalls are, how good your IDPS solutions are, how good your web filtering is. Your end user is the one that's going to end up clicking the link, that's open the attachment, do something that's going to introduce some sort of malicious attack into your enterprise. So keeping your end users updated with good social awareness campaigns as a necessity. Internet surfing, controlling what your users can and cannot do in your enterprise is very important. There's a lot of businesses that let their users go to social sites like Facebook and other types of sites like that that can be very damaging to your enterprise because there's an influence of possible malware from those sites. Allowing them to surf personal email thwarts all the protection that you put on your business email by allowing them to go straight to personal email. So internet surfing protection is an enormous amount of requirement in your business because that is a very viable method of attack. Email is probably one of the most common methods of attack, delivering malicious attachments, delivering hyperlinks that go to malicious sites through email systems, very common campaign, and it requires a lot of safeguard controls. Poorly configured perimeters. Now, I included this on this slide because I see it a lot out there where firewalls are set up and then they're forgotten, and they're stale, and access rights or allowances are still located in those devices that's never been removed, and so those doors still remain open on their firewall. Tightening and strengthening the controls within your device should be done regularly, and don't allow it to become stale. Weak authentication associates to weak password usage and not utilizing elements like multi-factor authentication to require a second level of authentication into your application or into your website or whatever. You need to make sure that you use strong passwords, which would include a complexity requirement. You should have a certain length of password requirement, a certain number of days required before you have to change your password. And if you deploy MFA, you can reduce some of those controls because you're adding a second layer. So if the password is compromised, they can't get in through that single point of entry. Poorly patched systems, obviously that goes to the vulnerability associated to weak patches. If you're not properly keeping your systems up to date, then they're subject to attack. They're subject to vulnerability. You got to make sure that the latest security patches that are released regularly, first of all, make sure that they're verified. Don't be the first on the block to install a recent patch. You need to make sure that the patch has passed some tests, but then make sure you get your patches deployed on your environment so they're no longer vulnerable.
Well, clearly, security prevention is not a once-and-done exercise. Further, with people working from everywhere, 24/7, mobile threats must be an increasing risk also because they too can result in data loss, security breaches, and regulatory compliance violations. What do you recommend, Scott, that organizations who have mobile and remote workers do to reduce their risk?
I'm glad we're talking about remote workers because they're kind of like the forgotten part. The business works so hard to protect their local infrastructure that they're really not thinking about the security for the remote users that are connecting into their network and possibly causing more malicious access to their network. So let's talk about some of these categories. Simple remote access. The fact that a lot of businesses still use simple remote desktop access into their network. This would be port 3389 on the firewall. That is probably one of the most common vectors of attack for ransomware that's out there right now. There are golden bots out there that are actually looking if 3389 is open. And if it is, then it pounds it with a brute force dictionary attack to see if it can identify a weak authentication principle to get into the network. That is how it's happening. It happens a lot. And the fact that people and companies are still using simple remote access is amazing to me. You need to secure it with some level of VPN control. Let them VPN into the business so that there's a private encrypted tunnel between the remote user and the business, and then let them 3389 or remote access into whatever server that they need to gain access to. But don't let them have remote access, simple 3389 into your network. Endpoint protection. We talked about the fact that malware protection and antivirus controls are important on machines, but you need to have more than that. You need to have complete endpoint control on especially devices that are remote. You need to control the applications that they can use. You need to control the websites that they can go to still, even though they're a remote. When they're away from your main network gateway, they have access to go to the internet and do anything they want. And if they're utilizing a VPN tunnel into your network and they're infected, now they have a way for that infection to move into your private network. So use complete endpoint control on your endpoints for your remote users. Your internet access, once again, controlling what your users can actually get to by utilizing a web filter type of protection on that device that they're using remote, and allow them to go into only sites that are important for conducting your business, and utilizing an advanced threat protection control on those devices so that ransomware cannot enter through those devices and then once again transition to your private network. Data protection, keeping data that exists on remote devices safe is very important. So if it's a remote device, if it's a traveling system, the odds of it becoming lost or stolen is much greater. And so you need to make sure that the data exists on them are protected. By doing full disk encryption on any traveling system, you maintain a level of protection that is very important for protecting the data that exists on those devices. Email protection, we've already talked about the importance of having strong email. You should have a gateway for all of your email filtering so that everything is removed before it ever enters your business. And that way, as your remote users move away from, once again, the primary infrastructure protection, they're still protected by an email gateway that allows all the business email to be filtered for malicious activity. And harden your systems. Any system that's out there should be hardened and protected by your enterprise. It should not be a personal system. Never let a remote user utilize their own system to access your private network. You don't know what's going on that system. You have no idea of the protection that's available or that's been installed on that system. Make sure that any remote user system is something that's been deployed by your enterprise and that is secure and hardened by your enterprise.
Thank you, Scott. So let's ask our audience what kind of protection measures they have in place for their mobile and remote workers. This is particularly important. So we're asking you if you have endpoint server and advanced threat protection as well. Perhaps, Scott, you can give us a bit of clarity around exactly what those are to make it simple for our audience to respond.
Remember that Complete Endpoint Server is not just an antivirus program. Antivirus is effective, but not nearly effective enough to keep endpoints safe. You should have USB drive control, whether they can utilize a USB control or not. You should have the ability to protect what applications can run on that system. That would be called application whitelisting. And you should have web control, what they can and cannot do on internet surfing. Advanced threat protection, we've already talked about, the ability to recognize threats not only by signature, but by behavior. And full disk encryption for traveling systems to make sure that if they're lost or stolen and compromised, that the data is still safe from wandering eyes. And simple RDP, port 3389 access, needs to have a level of protection associated with it. Don't just have 3389. If you just have 3389, you're allowing a simple attack to occur within your enterprise.
Thank you, Scott. It's always helpful to have some explanation in lay terms for all of us. So everybody's doing endpoint server protection. That's good news. The opposite news is none of them are allowing simple RDP and port 3389 access, so they've got that covered too. What do you think the middle ground says about forensics and disk encryption, Scott?
Well, it sounds like most of the users are utilizing encryption for their traveling systems. That's great. Those that don't, the data that exists on those systems may be a compromise should they be lost or stolen. Advanced threat protection, I think it's a newer technology. A lot of businesses are still depending on their antivirus controls to do the work for them. It's simply not enough. Those that did not check the box on ATP needs to really reconsider the ability for it to recognize ransomware. Anti-ransomware is part of the advanced threat protection format. Those that said no, allow simple RDP, that everybody's saying we're not doing that. You know, I can't tell you in the last 2 months I've worked with 20 different companies that have expressed to me that they received ransomware through a Port 3389 attack. So you really need to make sure, check with your IT teams and make sure that that's not open on your firewalls and open to the public without some level of encryption protection behind it.
Super, thanks. But mobile and remote workers are not the only challenge for organizations. Many organizations also are subject to serious regulatory compliance. Can you talk to us about that a bit, Scott?
Well, I mean, regulated industries, have a requirement of security associated with them, not just the simple necessity of it, but they're required to understand their security levels and the amount of security that they implement to protect their data. Financial services has GLBA, FDIC, FFIEC for requirements to protect the financial information that they're required to protect. Healthcare with healthcare information has HIPAA controls associated with it. Education has the requirement to protect student data so that they can't be viewed by anybody outside of the student or his family if they decide to allow their family access to that information. But FERPA is a requirement of security associated to student information. Retail has PCI, the DSS requirements to maintain the protection of credit card information that you process. The government has several different types of protections that are required if you have a vendor relationship with a government deliverable. FISMA, DFARS, ITAR are all popular regulatory requirements behind government entities. Energy and insurance also have their own specific requirements of data protection associated to their vector. So regulated industries, once again, it's not a matter of, hey, I want to protect my data. Regulated means you have to, and you're required to protect your data.
Thanks, Scott. Can we talk about how these regulatory security requirements actually break down into real life things that the organizations need to do and take it a bit out of the alphabet soup of the requirements?
Yeah, let's break some of these categories down with their obligations of requirement. And one of the first things I notice is that there's not a level of security understanding within an enterprise. Usually the IT manager is having to wear that hat, or a compliance manager is required to wear that hat. But somebody that has a specific understanding of security, like a CISSP level individual deployed in the environment to give understanding of what security controls are required and what the administrative controls requirements are and what the physical controls requirement are. A CSO, or if you can't afford a CSO, a virtual chief security officer, a VCSO, is offered by businesses in order to give you that understanding. And it's very important now, starting to become more and more requirement in compliance. Business continuity, a lot of businesses have a disaster recovery plan. What the regulatories are insisting on, what the auditor's looking for, is your practice of DR. How much are you actually putting it through the paces? And is your incident response plan been tested and verified? And do you have a continual review of that? Because every time you have an infrastructure change, you should have an update to your incident response plan. Your DR plan shouldn't be just the successfulness of the DR, like I was able to stand a server up at another location. You should be able to actually practice your operations in a DR model and get sign-off by departments that they agree that they can still do their job while you're in a DR state. That's proper business continuity. And a lot of businesses don't take it that far, and audits are starting to request and require that. End user security is, we've already stressed the fact that they're the weakest link, and a social awareness program has to be out there. They're starting to ask, hey, are you doing proper social testing and training? And are you evaluating how good your users are in their ability to identify malicious attacks? And so you need to make sure that you have good end user security and a security program in place. Risk management, You need to assess your risk. And if you're under regulatory compliance, you are required to have a risk assessment done every 12 to 18 months. So you need to make sure that you have an identification of what your risk is in your enterprise and what gaps exist in your current enterprise. Access control, we kind of talked about password controls. This goes right along with that. They're very interested in your access control. What users can access what data, what kind of access allowances are you giving them, how much password protection are you providing for those users and requiring for them to strengthen their authentication principles, and are you using a multi-factor authentication to strengthen your access controls? Data protection, protecting data as it moves and as it sits. So data at rest for data that just sits, you need to have some sort of encryption program available for protecting that data. And data that's in motion, like email is a perfect example of data in motion. Being able to encrypt anything that's sensitive that you would send through email, especially if it's related to your industry and it's under your compliance requirements. Data protection is super important. Security awareness, having an understanding of where vulnerability exists in your assets is a requirement. To do it once a year is not enough. I think in our previous poll, we saw that a lot of people, a lot of businesses are not doing quarterly, at least quarterly level vulnerability scanning. Your enterprise changes continuously. Every time there's a Microsoft Patch Tuesday, your enterprise just changed. And so you need to understand where your vulnerabilities lie so that you can properly place remediation efforts into those vulnerabilities, whether that's a patch or whether that's a change in the firmware. Regardless, you need to understand where your vulnerability is continuously, and quarterly vulnerability scans and penetration tests is a great start. Log management. Audits are really starting to influence how much log awareness that you're doing. And if you're just collecting logs so that you can review them after an incident, that is not a strategic nor nearly a proactive measurement of log control. They're starting to push an audit that you not only have a central data collector for your logs, but you're constantly reviewing them. Many businesses do not have the security level understanding to be able to review logs and be able to find out the information they need to be proactively in control. And a SOC as a service would be a perfect fit for a business that would require a continuous review of log management. A proactive detection would be a SOC as a service control at the perimeter level so that they're actually managing your perimeter devices. And if they see a threat at your firewall at 3 a.m., they stop it at 3 a.m. They don't wait until 8 o'clock in the morning for the IT team to get to work. They need a more proactive measurement of protecting your endpoints and protecting your perimeter controls. And the SOC as a service process can help with that as well.
Our third audience polling question is important for companies with compliance regulations. So we are asking you, our audience, are you practicing some of these or all of these critical compliance elements, which includes verify and testing your full DR, disaster recovery and failover? Are you performing risk assessments annually at least? Are you actively reviewing your server and device log data? And are you executing vulnerability assessments quarterly or better? Scott, in your experience, which of these categories are you seeing are left out most often?
The vulnerability assessments are usually not done quarterly. They're usually done once a year, usually in alignment with their risk assessments. That's not nearly enough. And log review, some people are going to answer this question and say, yeah, we collect our logs. We have a SIM solution, and so we have a center collector of the log information. But having somebody that's experienced, a security level professional that knows how to review that log is probably absent from their enterprise. I would say that that's very popular.
Interesting. We'll see if it matches the audience data. The fascinating part I find is that when we talk to people, we often see that they believe they're doing vulnerability assessments, but they don't always change their mechanisms for checking vulnerabilities as the infrastructure they have changes. So they may be testing old vulnerabilities repeatedly, but the ones that are added with their expanding infrastructure sometimes are left out. Do you see that as well, Scott?
Yeah, so they get kind of like static with their tests and scans. They don't include new VLAN creations and new IP addresses that have been submitted or assigned to devices that require a vulnerability scan. So that's very popular as well. And the DR testing failover, I bet a lot of companies, oh, there we got 43%. DR isn't just a matter of verifying, yes, I could start this server up over there. It's a matter of verifying that your business can operate in a DR platform.
Interesting, interesting. And as you indicated, the vulnerability assessments and the server logs are falling a bit low on the scale of importance, which increases the threat for the regulated industries.
And auditors are going to stand on that when they get audited.
Absolutely. So now what we're going to discuss are proactive protection measures that all organizations should have in place. Scott, can you tell us how businesses, this is the $64,000 question, how businesses can avoid becoming another one of those horrifying statistics?
All right. Number one, get a strategic consultant involved in your enterprise. Hire somebody. If you can't afford to hire a full-time CSO, utilize a virtual CSO program from a business. Netgain has one. A CISSP level professional that can guide you through your requirements of safeguard implementation. And not just for your technical controls, your physical controls and your administrative policy and procedure organization. You need somebody that can actually do that. Don't put that hat on somebody that's not experienced to do that. The employee social awareness uptick, we can't stress enough the importance of that requirement to have the actual employees learn and be trained on what to look for and how to recognize and what their responsibilities are if they identify some sort of malicious activity on their endpoint. You need to have constant training out there. Get involved in a program that will continually test throughout the year your employees and evaluating that performance. Quarterly security assessments at a minimum. Recognize where your vulnerability exists on your enterprise. If you're not doing it, get it done. You have to understand where your risks are, where your vulnerability is, so that you can protect it. You can plug that hole. You can remediate whatever that particular vulnerability is. You don't know unless you actually look and search for them. So execute quarterly security assessments. Update and test your incident response plan. So having an IRP is one thing, and an auditor is going to ask you if you have it, but how often do you put it through its paces? And do you update it every time there's an infrastructure change? You need to make sure that your IRP plan is ready to go. You want to find out if there's problems with your IRP before you have an incident, right? So put it through its paces. Find out how good it works. Find out the people that are going to be involved. Organize your critical systems so that you can execute your recovery models on those particular systems in the proper order. And what application relationships do you have to systems? You don't want to stand up one system if it has a dependency for another system that you haven't started yet. So make sure that you have a good, practiced IRP program. Email protection and encryption is vital because email protection is probably the most vector of attack out there. You need to make sure that you have good practice email. I recommend an email gateway more than just having an on-premise email filtering system. Let the gateway do all the work and filter all the malicious traffic out there before it reaches your enterprise. And utilize advanced threat protection in association with email so that you can actually get those anti-ransomware definitions out there and that behavioral analytics in control with finding that malicious attack before it ever reaches your enterprise. You're protecting data for in motion, adding encryption to protect sensitive information that you transfer for email. A lot of the gateway systems or gateway programs that are out there include an encryption package in which you can just place a simple subject line like the word secure into the subject, and it automatically encrypts the information included in that email so it remains protected, vital. And of course, if it's a traveling system, you want to make sure that your encryption is at full disk level so that you can protect the data if it's lost or stolen. Your endpoint server protection, you know, a lot of people voted really high on that polling question, and I think they put a lot of weight into their antivirus control. We use Symantec, or we use Trend Micro, we use Sophos. Whatever your control is, don't just hang your hat on your AV. Make sure that you're practicing all the different endpoint controls that you can practice. Protect your peripheral controls. Don't let users that shouldn't be transferring information from their PC to a USB drive or vice versa, taking data from a USB drive that may be malicious and putting it on your system. You need to have that control. If you're not practicing peripheral control, then you're not practicing complete endpoint. Application whitelisting controls, web controls, tamper resistance are all a part of complete endpoint control. So make sure that you're actually practicing complete endpoint control. Advanced threat protection, we kind of talked about this many times, but a lot of businesses just aren't using it. And there's a lot of advanced threat protection platforms out there that can provide the ability to recognize ransomware, called anti-ransomware programs association with ATP. Very important to get that out there so that you get that signature and behavioral analytic control associated with detection. Harden your devices and your system configurations. I can't stress this enough, how many times I go into an enterprise and I review their Active Directory structure, and the security for the Active Directory is out of the box. There's no turn up of it. There's no logging controls implemented. The security is just flat. You need to make sure you harden your controls. You need to harden your operating system controls. You need to harden your Active Directory controls, harden your group policy controls, harden your antivirus controls, and harden your firewall level controls on your devices as well to prevent internal attacks from occurring within your enterprise. You need to make sure that those are practiced, and you should have them logged as a policy and a procedure so that they recur every single time a device is deployed in your enterprise. Risk assessments, once again, going back to regulatory requirements, you need to have a risk assessment done every 12 to 18 months. But even if you're not compliance required, you need to understand where risk exists in your enterprise. So do a risk assessment every 12 to 18 months. Understand where risk is. Once again, risk evaluation is at the administrative, at the physical, and at the technical control levels. A vulnerability scan just identifies the assets and the vulnerabilities that exist there, but a risk assessment gives you more understanding so that you can not only position safeguards properly where they need to be positioned, and you can understand what policy and procedures need to be created and expressed throughout your enterprise so that everybody is aware of the controls and the safeguards and the necessity of protection that the enterprise has put out there as required. SOC as a service is an uptick in log management and peripheral control or perimeter control. So you need to make sure that if you're going to have the requirement of log review, if you're going to have the requirement of protecting your perimeter on a 24/7, 365, SOC as a service is very important. SOC is a security operations center. It is a facility that is nothing but security professionals that would have access to your logs and can provide you notification of something that's occurring within your systems currently that you can stop and be preventive of an attack. You can't get that with just your simple IT within your enterprise looking at your logs. There's so much white noise in logs that a security professional knows how to filter through and identify the attacks that exactly are existing within your enterprise, or maybe failures that are existing within your enterprise. But having a SOC as a service program is a major uptick, and it's starting to become something that auditors are talking about in regulatories as a direction that businesses need to start considering.
Thank you, Scott. Your security expertise is invaluable. We are now going to open up our webinar for questions. Again, as we noted, the questions you want to submit, you can put into the box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will address them as many as we can, and should we miss anyone, we're happy to contact you afterwards to discuss your particular needs and your questions regarding your organization. The first question we have for Scott is, Scott, you mentioned hiring a CSO or a CISO. Is that a compliance audit requirement?
It's not a requirement. Actually, in banking or in finance, if you went through the FFIEC Cyber Assessment Toolkit, you probably saw in there, do you have a security professional deployed in your environment or employed in your environment? It's starting to become an audit requirement. But forget audit requirements. Having somebody in there that understands security and giving you direction and being able to bring that information to the board so that they understand why security controls need to be implemented, why budget needs to be established for security is just vital to the operations. Get a CSO involved in your enterprise, or at least use a virtual chief security officer to help you move forward with your security platforms.
Got it. So SOC as a service, another audience member said, SOC as a service sounds good, but isn't that overkill?
A lot of businesses think that it is. They got their logs are collected, they're available for me to review should I have an incident. That's reactive. You have no way of being proactive in your measurement of log control, log review without a SOC as a service platform. Remember, SOC is a security operations center. It is full of security professionals that are looking at your logs in near real time. And when they see something that's malicious or something that's suspicious, they can give you notification that, hey, this is something that's happening at your firewall, or this is something that's happening on your server, and you need to make sure that you close that door or you remove whatever that vulnerability is. And so SOC as a service is a more proactive control. It's not overkill. It's moving it from reactive to proactive.
Which I would assume saves people a lot of money when they do get attacked.
It could have prevented the attack from ever happening.
There you go. So you mentioned earlier that cloud attacks are among the current cyber threats. Does this mean you shouldn't store information in the cloud?
I'm not saying that. Clouds is the direction of the future. A lot of businesses are starting to rely on the cloud for their stores. They don't want to be their own network operations center. They don't want to be the place where data is actually stored. They want it stored in the cloud, and that's fine. All I'm saying is that it's your responsibility to protect the data when it's in the cloud as well. Don't just put it up in the cloud and assume it's secure. Go through the practices of evaluating the security. Make them provide audit information about how secure their environment is, and actually execute scans against your environment while it exists in the cloud to recognize vulnerability. But it's your requirement to make sure that the data you put out there is safe.
Great. We've got a couple more questions I'm going to note for our audience. There is a poll up on your screen. Should you desire that you have a discussion with Scott or one of our security experts after this meeting, click the box and we will follow up with you so you can discuss your particular needs and what your organization is currently doing. So we have a couple more questions, Scott. The first one is, I understand the full disk encryption is important for traveling systems, but do we need to encrypt in-house systems and or servers as well?
No, you do not need to encrypt your in-house systems, especially your servers. Encrypting your servers with a full disk encryption can make it very problematic to recover. If there's an issue with that system, utilizing a backup strategy with an encrypted platform behind it makes it difficult and maybe make it impossible. So no, do not full disk encrypt servers. You can encrypt at the file level. And so as the file moves between shares or whatever, you can place a single file level encryption program, but not full disk encryption. Full disk encryption should really be only utilized on traveling.
Thanks. Our next question is about DR. So regarding DR testing, what should be included when verifying you have a good, solid disaster recovery plan?
Most of the disaster recovery plans that I come across and I evaluate simply have IT sign off that it works. They were able to shut down the server at point A, and they were able to stand up the server at point B, and they were able to access the server and access the files, and they sign off and they say that that's good. A DR solution actually is in how you're going to operate your business during a disaster. And so getting full departmental sign off during your DR testing is very important. You need to make sure that applications work as they're supposed to. You make sure that departments sign off that they can conduct their business orderly and organized as they could while it's in a DR state. And you need to make sure that the securities followed to the DR platform. The securities that you've implemented for your day-to-day operation, your standard business operation, that in a DR state are still there, and that you've not reduced your security footprint simply because you're in a DR state. You don't know how long you're going to live in the DR state, so you need to make sure that you're secure while you're there.
Thanks, Scott. I'd also like to mention again that on the audience's screen, there is an option for scheduling an executive overview for your team, and we would be happy to do that and send in a security expert to talk to you about your organizational challenges around security. Scott, can you share your experience with a ransomware issue and the outcome without divulging names?
Sure. In this particular example, ransomware was introduced into the enterprise early in the morning. It overwhelmed help desk by about 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, IT was scrambling to try to shut down as many systems as it could to avoid infection. With no understanding that VPNs were open to other branches and other directions, and so the spread occurred rapidly throughout the branch offices as well. When we finally got notified about it and then was asked to assist, we've discovered that there was no incident response plan already established for the company. And so we had to build the incident response plan. And the process of remediation or the process of recovery was delayed because all of the local copies of the backups were infected because they were connected. They were available to reach by the infection, and so they were no longer available to us. So we had to reach to offsite copies in order to recover, but the amount of data to recover was very large. And so now I think the expectations of RPO and RTO, the recovery point objectives and the recovery time objectives that a business may have had, what these, at least the executive team may have thought that they had, were really out the door, and there was no way to meet those time frames. And we were scrambling to try to bring them up as quickly as possible. Before we could get them completely recovered, I think their expectation was around 72 hours. It was 4 weeks before everything was actually back online. You know, we got certain things up and running manually. We were able to get some things up immediately, but before they were back to where they were before the infection was, it took around 4 weeks. So ransomware is just crippling to a business.
And now you seeing an uptick despite all the focus on security, where people still have or persist in having large holes that you can drive a truck through in their security awareness perimeter?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the 3389 is the perfect example. Like I mentioned, I think 5 different customers in the last few weeks have contacted us and said, "Hey, we got ransomware." And when we get in there and find out the point of entry, it was because they had remote desktop access open to the world, and 3389 was the cause. So,
despite the fact that when you ask them in general, everybody thinks they've got these holes plugged, huh?
well, sometimes executive leadership thinks that those doors are shut, but when they're actually reviewed, it may be a stale record, but nonetheless, it's still there, and it's influenced. Like I said, there are bots out there. I think they're called golden bots that actually look for 3389, and when it finds it, it beats it down with a brute force dictionary attack until it can reach an authentication level into the enterprise, and then from there it starts its destruction.
Wonderful. Well, we have, to meet our time commitment to our audience, again, the opportunity to have a discussion one-on-one is on your screens. Just tick a box and there will be follow-up. We want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar today, and thank you so much, Scott, for your insights.
Thank you for having me once again. This is something that I believe in strongly, and I hope I expressed some great information for you guys to utilize.
You did, and our webinar is at an end. And we'll see you next time.